2. Good morning and welcome to online Sunday school again. This week we're going to try having class in the fellowship hall at 9:30. Hopefully that will go smoothly as well, but those of you who cannot attend in person, we want to make sure that you have the opportunity to hear the lessons as well. Let's go to the Lord in prayer first. Father, I thank you so much for the opportunity we have to seek you and to study your word. Thank you for your word that gives us wisdom. It gives us a path and a pathway of life that it is going to work for each one of us. We thank you so much you've given us this timeline and these instructions that are so pertinent to our life today, even though they were written hundreds and thousands of years ago. We thank you so much, Lord, for the life you give us, even though our country is in turmoil at this time. I thank you for the peace of that passes all understanding that you give each of us in our hearts, that we can have peace even though there's a storm around us. I ask, Lord, that you'd bless this lesson. May each one of us take something new from it that we can apply to our lives and use wisely as you have described in your word. In Jesus' precious name, we ask these things. Amen. All right, since we've been quarantined, I haven't shared any jokes with you, so I thought I'd include a couple with this week's lesson. Do you see yourself in either one of these? Miss Jones is pretty much what I look like for the first few weeks until we got back to at least having church. And Mona Lisa, I can really identify. When there's nothing else to do, you eat, don't you? Or at least I do. Okay. Today, we begin a new lesson or a new study of the book of Proverbs. Some people seek out professional analysts to help them navigate this world, while others turn to their trusted friends and mentors. Solomon discovered that the only place to go when trying to figure out this world was to the one who created it in the first place. That is so pertinent to our daily life now. Solomon recorded the wisdom God revealed to him in Proverbs and Song of Songs. Throughout this study, we will be clarifying our understanding of words such as wisdom, knowledge, information, fool, understanding, and fear. Think for a moment about how would you describe the difference between knowledge and wisdom? As we study Proverbs, we will discover the foundation for wise decisions and how our knowledge and the information we receive applies in everyday life. The knowledge of God and the knowledge to live wisely are interrelated. Next to the knowledge of God and salvation, the knowledge to live wisely is the most important kind of knowledge. Godly knowledge is more than information. It is about transformation. You can be factually right, but spiritually wrong. Solomon's argument in the book of Proverbs is simple. Godly wisdom is applied truth that leads to transformation and wise, practical living. Anyone who paid attention to godly wisdom would have no reason to fear as they face their future. Only foolish people would discard God's wisdom. Fools aren't mentally deficient, but rather make consistently bad choices. So let's move on and start with Proverbs 1:7. The first 6 verses are an introduction. And so we're going to start with verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. From the vantage point of this verse, the true source of knowledge comes into clear view. Another word for knowledge could be discernment. In the Old Testament world, knowledge bore a striking similarity to wisdom. Wise believers see God's way so they can do things His way. Wisdom has a starting point. It begins with a relationship with the Lord. Growing in wisdom by walking with the Lord seems to be contrary to some of the popular notions about how someone becomes wise. For instance, some people believe that life experiences cultivate wisdom, but without God's help, experiences themselves can lead a person to draw conclusions that might not be wise at all. Other people insist that age brings wisdom. They believe that the longer people live, the wiser they become. Well, granted, wisdom may come with age, but only if the years have been spent in a deepening walk with the Lord. Neither life experiences nor long life guarantee wisdom. Wisdom comes from the Lord, who works in the experiences and through the years to show His people how to see things His way so that we can do things His way. A productive relationship with the Lord is characterized by fear. Fearing God doesn't mean He terrorizes us or makes us dread the notion of being in His presence. Instead, fearing the Lord involves reverencing, respecting, and trusting Him. Also, a deep sense of awe, worship, and humble submission to Him. We acknowledge our accountability to Him for the ways we think, speak, and act each day. Solomon encouraged people to take their walk with the Lord seriously. The psalmist, like Solomon, underscored the same connection in Psalms 111:10. Job also pointed to the value of fearing the Lord. He declared that fearing the Lord was wisdom itself. Job 28:28. The beginning of knowledge means its foundation, because we never cease to need it. The book of Proverbs assumes that we can't make sense of the world or live a full and successful life unless we see God behind it and involved in it. By contrast, fools have no use for God. We might say they are morally twisted. They don't cherish the wisdom God can give. In fact, they despise it and even ridicule it. As a result, their foolish choices leave them unprepared to face the challenges that come every day, as well as the outcomes they face in eternity. I think we're seeing some of that acted out in our nation today. Those challenges have been so frustrating, people don't know what to do with them. And so they act out in ways that are very destructive. All right, moving on to the path of obedience, verses 8 and 9. Listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. They are a garland to grace your head and a chain to adorn your neck. In verse 8, Solomon began to instruct his own son. He may have been talking to Rehoboam, the son who would become the next king. We know that Proverbs focuses on instructing male children, which reflects the reality that most cultures of the ancient Near East were male-dominated. Today, the wisdom principles of Proverbs surely are relevant for followers of Christ of both genders and, of course, of all ages. By encouraging his son to listen, Solomon pointed to an important discipline for growing in God's wisdom. Listening means more than hearing. To listen means to pay attention, absorb, interpret, and apply what's being said. God's wisdom comes to believers who learn the discipline of listening. Notice that Solomon urged his son to listen to his instruction. The worst decision his son could make as a young person would be to ignore or neglect it. Neglecting his father's instruction would lead him to forget it altogether. Solomon also directed his son to pay close attention to what his mother taught him. Proverbs 31 provides an excellent example of godly wisdom that a mother passed on to her son. In verse 9, having pointed to the need to take God's wisdom seriously, Solomon focused on the reward that awaited God's people who put it into practice. He highlighted the reward by comparing it to two items of clothing that signified victory and honor in ancient cultures. A garland placed on their heads signified they had accomplished something important. Perhaps they had won a race or a battle. By connecting garland with seeking wisdom, Solomon assured his son that God would be gracious to him as he lived in wisdom. When we think about God's favor, we may be tempted to consider it a reward we must earn, but this is flawed thinking. It ignores the absolute wonder of God's grace, his unmerited favor. And when we allow him to grace us with the gift of his wisdom, we will display it in our lives. It's an action as well as thought. In those days, chains likewise signified honor. For instance, Pharaoh placed a gold pendant around Joseph's neck in Genesis 41:42. He wore the pendant to signify the honorable status he had been given. And in Daniel 5:29, Belshazzar put a gold pendant around Daniel's neck for the same reason. All right, moving on to a section called Resisting Sin. Proverbs 1:10-14. Solomon says, "My son, if sinful men entice you, do not give in to them. If they say, 'Come along with us,' let's lie in wait for innocent blood. Let's ambush some harmless soul. Let's swallow them alive like the grave and whole like those who go down to the pit." In verses 8 and 9, Solomon emphasized the positive rewards of obeying parental instruction. Beginning in verse 10, he focuses on the negative results of taking the opposite way of life, which of course is the way of sin. Solomon understood that to resist temptation, his son would need to determine ahead of time that he would turn down an invitation to do evil. The same can be said for us. We must always have a ready response to any temptation that comes our way. And I think at our age, we have learned that. If you're not ready for a response, you make mistakes. Resistance starts by avoiding close relationships with sinful people and groups. Solomon described these gang members as sinful men. They had rejected God's ways and had embraced a life aimed only at pleasing themselves. They just wanted to have fun, and their recruiting efforts could be extremely persuasive. Wow, is that pertinent to our time of living in our society? To help his son, and of course us, reject the gang's invitation, Solomon described it in vivid detail, preparing him for what they would say. The notion of setting an ambush for someone passing by would have a devilish charm to it. For them, killing some harmless soul would be a way to have fun and gain a sense of power. They would say that murdering someone would be like swallowing them alive. That privilege had only been reserved for the pit or the grave, which is of course the abode of the dead. Verse 13, we will get all sorts, the gang goes on to say, we will get all sorts of valuable things and fill our houses with plunder. Cast lots with us and we will all share the loot. In these verses, the theoretical gang goes on to say, so in other words, they would say that murdering an innocent person would be a way to gain wealth. Any young person who pondered the possibilities of getting rich would have a tough time turning down such an invitation. They could imagine the valuable things they would accumulate without having to work for it. Neither would they have to wait for it. Their homes would soon be filled with the wealth that came from property they would steal from people they murdered. The gang would add that their invitation even came with a guarantee. They would promise that every gang member would get a fair share of the loot. Now they expect to be trusted. The gang failed to mention that the new member would share the risk of getting caught and punished. Why would anyone accept such an invitation? All right, moving on to the next slide. Sin's results. In verse 15, he says, "My son, do not go along with them. Do not set foot on their paths. For their feet rush into evil, and they are swift to shed blood." Solomon encouraged his son to resist the temptation to go along with gang members who would try to recruit him. He needed to resist temptation from the start. We know from experience that resisting temptation is all the more difficult after one has yielded to it even once. They choose to go along with a foolish path they're considering to be thrilling. It sounded to them like something that could be entertaining and fun, but as Solomon pointed out, that road wouldn't take them where they wanted to go. They were swift to shed blood, which ends in their own shed blood, as we will see. Solomon urged his son never to take that first step. In verse 17, how useless to spread a net where every bird can see it. These men lie in wait for their own blood. They ambush only themselves. Such are the paths of all who go after ill-gotten gain. It takes away the life of those who get it. The saying about the bird and the net might be interpreted in a couple of ways. Some Bible students think it to mean that a bird may be watching the person who's trying to spread a net and, of course, avoiding it. Other Bible scholars point to the fact that birds get trapped because they can only see the grain. They don't notice the net. Taken either way, the picture of the bird and the net point to the outcome for individuals who ignore God. When they follow such a foolish path, they don't notice the deadly trap that's been set for them by their own evil behavior. It's not visible at first. In the shadows, they waited quietly for the chance to ambush others, but ended up being ambushed themselves by their own actions. They become trapped by their own plots to kill somebody else. No wonder Solomon tried to warn his son about the path, which is a lifestyle foolish people would take when greed consumed them. They would always be looking around them for opportunities to profit from the valuables that they would take from someone else. Greed had plagued God's people in ancient Israel, just as it does in today's society. And we know that God used his prophets to hold them accountable. For instance, in Ezekiel 22:27, the prophet pointed to the greed of God's people as he confronted them with the sins that led them into captivity. Habakkuk also had to confront God's people for their sinful actions that had been fostered by their greedy ways in Habakkuk 2:6-12. Ignoring God's wisdom still puts a person's life in jeopardy. For that reason, mature Christians eagerly seek his wisdom through his word. We want to please him and not ourselves. For that reason, we need to reject greed of all kinds. So Jesus declared in Matthew 16:26, "For what will it profit someone if he gains the whole world yet loses his life? Or what will anyone give in exchange for his life?" So in review, our author highlights several important issues. First, true wisdom starts with a right relationship with God. Then, Obedience to godly counsel leads to favor in life. Also, wise believers resist the pressure to engage in wicked activities. And finally, ignoring godly wisdom leads to self-destruction. Solomon cared, obviously, a lot for his own son, and he wanted to explain to him very carefully how he could lose his life, but more importantly, lose his soul because of wicked ways that might tempt him as he became king, as he went through life. Solomon was, of course, a very wise person, and we would be very wise to heed his words as well, wouldn't it? Think about the times in your life when you ignored that godly wisdom and decided to do whatever you wanted to do. Did it end well? Did it end like you expected? Most likely not. All right, let's close in prayer. I thank you, Lord, for the opportunity we have to study your word. The things that Solomon put down for us to learn by is just remarkable. Those of us who have lived, probably some of us who have lived both ways and used the wisdom and not used the wisdom, have realized that Solomon's wisdom works every time. Your wisdom, God, works every time in our lives, and we thank you so much for the blessings that you pour out upon us when we follow your word, follow your wisdom, live wisely, put your wisdom into action in our lives. I ask now, Lord, for your protection upon each person who's listening, each person, excuse me, who would listen to your word enough to let it sink into their hearts and put it into action and share it with others. Godly wisdom is to be shared, not to be kept to ourselves, and we need to understand that and to use, that's one way of putting your wisdom to action. Lord, I ask for another wonderful week that you will give us, protect us, and bring us back together again next week. In Jesus' precious name, we ask all these things. Amen.